Good evening. This is Alan Dargam, one more time here hosting a new session with the MCF. The May Shidyat Foundation Media Institute is conducting this talk entitled The U.S. Army and Lebanese Army, the trajectory ahead under the project Renewing Lebanon's Political and Economic Structures in partnership with the Public Affairs section at the U.S. Embassy as usual. Very interesting talks every time, and we have interesting guests regarding this topic with the retired General Ziad Al-Hashim, LAF, former Deputy Chief of Staff for Planning, and Colonel Robert Miney, U.S. Army Senior Defense Official Defense Attaché. And from Zoom will join us as well Aram Nerguzian, Senior Associate EC inside the G Center for Strategic and International Studies, Senior Advisor Program on Civil Military Relations in Arab States, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Welcome as well. Bilal Saab, Senior Fellow and the Director of the Defense and Security Program in the Middle East Institute. Interesting. Our topic is very clear. We're going to definitely focus on Lebanese army here. Starting with you, General. The economic crisis is impacting the entire country, as we all see here, as we feel it as well. But I would like to discuss the impacts for the Lebanese army forces. What are the current needs for now?
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak at this forum and to address some of these important issues. Look, there are several needs that the Lebanese armed forces have, and I think the easiest way to look at them are kind of in categories. You can look at them strategically, operationally, and tactically. From a strategic point of view, whatever the needs are, and there are many of them, we're taking them very systematically. We have, for example, a 5-year security assistance roadmap that we've developed in conjunction with the Lebanese armed forces to make sure that we are addressing the needs that they say they need. We're also working on a capabilities development plan. It's been in effect from 2017 to 2022. We're extending it out, and I'm happy to say that my guest here, the guest here on my left, was helping to develop that. That continues. From a more operational point of view, the needs that they have, you can say more simply, are quite simply things that they need to sustain operations. Everything from fuel, food for soldiers, spare parts, things like this. And I'm very happy to be working with General Aoun and his staff to make sure that these needs are addressed.
General, here our general went to Washington and his demands were clear. He wants to support not only, as you mentioned, from fuel, food, and other important needs for the army, but as well how to provide the Lebanese soldier money. As you know, with our currencies deteriorating day after day, maybe the minimum wage now doesn't exceed $60 a month.
That's right. With the devaluation of the Lebanese lira, the soldiers' actual purchasing power has dropped significantly. I'm really impressed by the soldiers' ability to continue to stay focused on their mission, come to work. Their selfless service is admirable. So one of the ways that we are addressing this issue is an initiative being spearheaded by our ambassador, Ambassador Dorothy Shea, and our political military team. She
was with him in this trip as well.
She and I.
Yeah. Oh, were you there? Okay.
I was.
Okay, perfect.
And I think it was a very productive trip. And I want to thank General Aoun for coming to that trip and for Joint Staff and the Chairman for supporting it. But what we are doing is, the idea is to repurpose $67 million or so in foreign military financing for LAF livelihood support, to take care of soldiers, to help them cope with the current economic crisis, and to buy time for the Lebanese government to address needed reforms so that they can proceed with an IMF loan. But regardless, so if your question is about Lebanese soldiers and addressing their needs, let me assure you it's something very important to the ambassador and to the entire country team working to make it happen.
We'll go more into details regarding this matter, because that was major demand for the General Aoun in his last trip to Washington. Welcome again.
Thank you.
We see they're doing a lot to help the Lebanese army, but how can we both work together to make our army stronger and more strength? And of course, we have many challenges. Maybe our major theme was fighting terrorism. What's our team today, and how can we work together with them to take this advantage, to take these knowledge and know-how and experiences to enhance and advance our army?
First, let me start by saying thank you for hosting me in this project. I will try to contribute my 39 years of experience in the service. I'm an infantry officer.
Great.
In my last position as Deputy Chief of Staff for Planning, I was working with the American team, including Colonel Main. When you talk about LAF, the first problem you will face is the lack of national security strategy. The lack of the national security strategy, none of our governments since the late 40s till now write down a national security strategy. That a sub of it will go to the Ministry of Defense, where they will write a defense strategy, and then they will forward it to the LAF to write the military strategy. This will not facilitate our work. Upside down, we are working from the bottom to the top, writing our military strategy. For us, the challenges as threat are related to the doctrine that we work under, how we fight, how we do our business. So we are facing these threats and challenges. And then, according to our doctrine, you need defense resources. These defense resources, I will focus on three lines of effort here. First, the human resources. Here we are talking especially about the personnel. Before this crisis, they couldn't help us because we didn't need any help in the personnel line of effort.
Like now, salaries?
By example.
Like personal salaries?
Yes, I will go in details about that. But when you talk about training, and then you talk about equipments, and you train our personnel on these equipments or on these weapon systems, according to our doctrine, how we fight. Here comes the help and assistance and the sponsoring of the...
Since when? What year?
We are talking about... Okay. The collaboration and contribution of the U.S. Go back decades ago. But after 2019, and after the crisis, the economic and financial crisis that we are facing, especially the budget cut, especially the devaluation of our lira against the dollar. Imagine 90-95% devaluation of our lira. This is a huge problem to the left. So if we go by the first line of effort, we are talking about human resources and personnel. Here we have a huge problem. You are talking about 80,000 troops, including officers, NCOs, and just soldiers, having this problem. Not only them, but their families also. So you cannot separate a personnel not obliged to take his family to the healthcare facility in the left. So we are talking about 80,000 troops plus their families. It's a huge burden. Here, for the personnel, we ask the United States and other friendly countries to intervene and try to help us in the first one. In the training sector, we are relying on the foreign countries because we don't have the special amount of money to give it to our officer or our NCO or our soldier to go and be trained over there. So we are relying on the per diem they are giving our troops being over there to be trained by foreign military.
Is the US the only donor helping?
The United States is the
only country who is helping our Lebanese army from all these sides that you're discussing?
The United States is the first.
And the last?
No, it's the first. We are talking about 80% of our aid coming from the United States. And then we have others, and I would like to say thank you for all of them, including Britain, France, etc.,
okay.
etc. But the first contributor is the USA.
For sure.
Okay, so we go by training, and they are doing a great job. After 39 years in the left, this is the first time you see a professional army called Lebanese Armed Forces because of the contribution to countries like USA First and other
Definitely.
Friendly.
Other institutions.
So now you can see we are having a Lebanese Armed Forces, highly professional, highly trained, and highly efficient in doing their missions, executing their missions. So this is the first time we achieve this level of readiness and effectiveness due to the contribution of our friends, including the USA, which is, I will say it again, the first contributor assisting us, building our capability and capacity to be able to execute our missions.
Maybe we can use your experience later to expand our conversation regarding what the Lebanese army needs to continue its mission as it is, despite all the challenges, one of them the economic crisis. Let's go to Bilal Saab. I think you're in Washington, if I'm not mistaken, Bilal. Bilal? So let me just ask you this first question. What happened in Fajr al-Jurud, and why is this battle considered the clearest evidence of LAF's evolution?
Sure. First of all, thanks a lot for hosting me, and it really is nice to be with old friends. And I was just telling Rob and Aram before we went online that we're going to have a series of violent agreements, but that's a good thing. So,
for sure.
And I hope that we can be challenged with your questions. Let me tackle the question because I really think it's a good one. If you're looking for any kind of proof that this military investment by the United States is actually paying off, I mean, there's no better example than really Fajr al-Jurud and the impeccable performance of the Lebanese armed forces in that specific battle. Certainly helped that the LAF with U.S. assistance had more teeth, right? So specifically air power. And they certainly had better eyes through a number of technologies with Scan Eagle and so on and so forth. So that was very helpful. And it certainly also was helpful that they have been able to transform over a number of years from kind of a heavy force, right, as it was back in the 80s, to a lighter, faster, more special forces-centric kind of army with the help of the Americans also. So with those two attributes, which were extremely helpful, now let me get to the basically the proof as to why the LAF was so proficient on all three levels of war: the tactical, the operational, and the strategic. They moved well, they communicated very well, they shot very well, and they maneuvered very well. And if you're going to make a comparison to their performance to what happened in Al-Barid, it's almost like night and day, right? If there's any indication of improvement, of evolution, you look at what happened in Al-Barid, and then you look at what happened in Fajr al-Jurud, and then you could clearly see
the difference,
the dramatic improvement in terms of performance.
Bilal, since you told me you like to be challenged, and I'm open to that as well. You know that you have voices in Washington. They say Fajr al-Jurud, it was accomplished by Hezbollah. The Lebanese army was only just as a picture on the front line, just for the image. And some voices tried many times in Washington, and some colleagues of you, to cut the funding for the Lebanese army based on these accusations. What's your take on that?
Well, I hope you're not referring to colleagues of mine at the Middle East Institute.
No, I mean like in different think tanks. That's what I meant.
Sure. Yeah. No. Look, I'm aware of those voices. I've done my part to try to challenge those voices and to try to bring the same kind of evidence that I'm trying to show to you. And the picture that you just portrayed, again, shared by these voices, is wildly inaccurate. In no way was the performance and the role of the Lebanese armed forces in that battle symbolic. It was extremely effective, as I said, in all levels of war. They played the more instrumental role in terms of evicting those scores of fighters of ISIS from the north. It was far less an achievement by Hezbollah or the Syrian army. As a matter of fact, if anybody prevented the Lebanese armed forces from achieving a total victory and the decisive defeat of the enemy, it was Hezbollah and the Syrian army, because of this very last-minute deal that they concocted that enabled the enemy to travel, to cross the borders on that very infamous bus, which was frankly very much, I would say, disappointing to the Lebanese army, because once again, it did rob them of that decisive victory.
With this administration, how confident they are with this administration of this army, with General Zafaoun back in Washington?
Oh, I think we're in good shape. We're definitely in much better situation than we were during the Trump administration. I mean, those voices came out during that era, during the presidency of Donald Trump, and I was in the Pentagon. I was in the building, and I was overseeing all security cooperation programs and activities across the area of operations of CENTCOM. And so I had to deal with those myself. I had to actually coordinate with the former ambassador in Beirut, and so I was very much aware of that fight. And it was a fight worth waging for all the good reasons that Rob and others have been talking about. But we're in a better shape now. I think that the confidence, at least in terms of military leadership, right, in CENTCOM has remained the same. I think that the political atmosphere has much improved, but it's always risky to make very optimistic projections for the future because the fiscal environment in Washington is always tricky. The strategic environment also has changed because of our de-emphasizing of the Middle East as a whole, and not just Lebanon, right? And our focus on other priority regions, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific or in Europe now lately, especially given the Russian war against Ukraine. So, it's beyond politics. It's an issue also of strategic environment that's changed. It's also an issue of resources. But again, I'll say for the third time, we're in much better shape today.
Maybe we're going to talk more about CENTCOM when I come back to you, Bilal. Let's go now to Aram Nerguzyan. Aram, how good, capable are the LAF at their peak? Where are you, Aram?
Hi, Anna. Look, the primer by Bilal was a good segue. I would describe the peak of the LAF in terms of funding and resourcing to be around 2017 to 2018-19. That peak is a LAF that can do combined armored maneuver with infantry, coordinating with air power, the ability to rewrite a lot of the doctrine on how to use, in some cases, older systems with what was once assumed to be limited capabilities in the guided domain, like laser-guided munitions. Completely rewriting the book on the battlefield, teaching American trainers back lessons about how to reutilize some systems. Where we are now is a peak without some of the underlying flexibility and resource. You still have an LAF in 2022 that is motivated, that is cohesive. It is those things in part because of the unifying effect of command, not just the commander, but command, an entourage of peers across a couple of generations of senior leadership. And you have an LAF that has a key asset built up over the last 15 years, which is a professional NCO corps, non-commissioned officer corps. The LAF probably has one of the best NCO corps in the Arab Middle East, frankly. You do have all of the pressures that my colleagues described. You have a collapsed fiscal environment. You have no procurement budget, and you have little to any attention by successive governments since the start of Lebanon's financial spiral, who have paid much more than lip service to the underlying pressures on defense economics. Despite that, they have a military that shows up for work, that is the critical pillar for the basic stability the Lebanese enjoy, and remains pound for pound one of the best militaries in the Middle East, often lacking only one critical resource, which is effective civilian control of the military with a guiding direction on national security planning, much like General Hashim described, which trickles down to a national military strategy. We have still, even in the worst of conditions in Lebanon.
Aram, before and after the crisis, how would you evaluate the performance of the Lebanese army? Did you see any changes? I understand from you, no, they remain the same performance, but in a larger picture, I mean, since I'm a journalist on a daily basis here, I've seen the army playing the role of the police nowadays. They're capable of controlling unstable situation, very sensitive. The Tayuni, I'm going to talk more about the Tayuni in a bit. So what's your take on that?
Look, you have a military that on the one hand abides civilian control of the military in a socioeconomic political crisis, tries to follow orders, but also has to weigh those orders against the role and the stabilizing effect of the LAF on the ground. This is a military that's purposefully avoided getting into situations where it is repressive, where it is dealing with public discontent. It sympathizes with those pressures. You have other security institutions that often conduct operations I would describe well outside the norms and laws that govern institutions entrusted with public order. The parliamentary police comes to mind. It doesn't help that units like the parliamentary police have uniformed personnel from the ISF and the LAF who are no longer in those institutions but wear uniforms that look similar. So there's confusion in the public. And despite that, the LAF has managed to remain the credible national security actor. It hasn't been easy. The economic crisis has left the LAF in an environment where cohesion is the name of the game. In 2020, the LAF was an 81,700 strong force. Today, in practical terms, it's gone down by about 4,200 personnel. And that's a side effect of people trying to take their lives into their own hands. If they think that they're up for retirement, they try to retire. Despite that, you have an LAF that is actively encouraged personnel retention. Okay, so they've done very well over the course of the last 18 months at retaining critical talent. So this is very difficult to do the public order mission, to maintain internal cohesion, to not lose that critical gray matter, those top performers across the officer corps, the NCO corps, and enlisted personnel, while they're being paid, frankly, well above and beyond the level of effort they're putting in to do their basic duty in ensuring this country continues to exist, is the challenge at hand.
Thank you, Aram. I'll get back to you to speak more and more about this topic. This is the topic today, crisis, the performance of the Lebanese army. Despite the crisis, the Lebanese army is still maintaining its operations. How would you evaluate its performance today?
You know, I'm really impressed with the performance of the Lebanese armed forces. They do a lot of things really well. You've heard some of the other people mention special forces. I think that their special forces are outstanding, and I think we're going to have an opportunity to show that again this summer when we do Resolute Union 22, an exercise that's going to bring together some of the joint forces along with the special forces to show how they can integrate and conduct operations more than just being the national QRF for stability operations, where I think most of the public may be familiar seeing them. I think that they do small things well. I think that they have, well, I don't think, I know, they have an excellent record when it comes to end-use monitoring, for example. We have supplied sensitive items to the LAF, and we've asked them to account for them, and when we do, they account for them. And I'll tell you, they have an A++ record using the American grading system, if that translates for a Lebanese audience. Yeah, I mean, if that translates to a Lebanese audience, they have an outstanding record when it comes to end-use monitoring.
Colonel, one time I was sitting in a restaurant in Washington, and you know, by coincidence, I met a trainer that came to Lebanon and trained the Lebanese army. He was telling me they are A students, exactly the way you're describing right now. How would you rank this army? Because you have a extended experience in this field. How would you rank this humble army? Because it's still humble, because we're going to talk about advanced weapon later, because I hear it all the time from the Lebanese public. But how would you rank this army with this capability and performance?
You know, one of our guests a moment ago, I think it was Aram, if it wasn't Bilal, I'm sorry, I don't remember. Somebody said one of the most capable armies in the Middle East. I would agree with that entirely. I've worked with militaries in South Korea. I've worked with militaries in Germany. I worked with the military in Serbia. And I've worked here. And, you know, they are head and shoulders above. I'll give you a small vignette. Recently, we had a young Lebanese officer go to the United States through our IMET training. It's a program that we invest about $3 million a year into. It's the second largest international military and education training, so-called IMET program in the world. We had a young Lebanese officer go to it and graduated as the honor graduate from the infantry officer basic course. I mean, think about the competition that officer is up against, and they come out as the honor graduate. I think that says a lot to the quality of the LAF soldier.
What makes them this brave or even advanced? And as we know, other countries have even more resources and capability of doing more stuff.
Well, I think the Lebanese army has the benefit of drawing from a great pool of potential candidates. The LAF is a cross-sectarian organization that enjoys broad popular support all throughout the country, north to south, east to west. They are the sole legitimate defense provider in the country. And the soldiers who come in, the officers who come in, they're well educated, they're multilingual, they're quick learners, they're eager, they're happy to be in the military, they're proud. There's competition to get in the military. And from that, you know, it's not hard to identify the best of the best, because this is who Lebanon is. You know, the people of Lebanon are proffering their young men and women, and I do want to mention the women. We've made some remarkable progress integrating women into the armed forces. For example, female helicopter pilots, just outstanding, and they're graduating at the top of their classes. So I think the short answer to your question is that the Lebanese population is a tremendous draft pool from which to bring people into the military. That's why they do well.
Just out of curiosity here, Colonel, how many U.S. military personnel we have on the ground here in Lebanon?
So, okay, so we have people here under two kind of categories, right? So we have people at the embassy. There's only a handful of us. They fall under me directly as the senior defense official. But then we have a number of other soldiers here in Lebanon, so-called about 100, no more than 100. You know, the numbers vary because teams come in and out. They're working with the Lebanese partners. They live with them. They train with them. They become friends with them. You know,
I see them in Batroun all the time.
Yeah. So
but there's a private, also private institutions as well, that defense private institutions as well on the ground here in Lebanon, from the United States?
No. It's all quite out in the open. Everyone's here under agreements with the Lebanese. This is a mutually beneficial relationship. We think that the Lebanese Armed Forces is a tremendous strategic partner, and they find us to be their partner of choice when they look around the world and ask who they want to collaborate with. And it's mutually beneficial.
Colonel, as we said, as I mentioned before, that our biggest challenge back in maybe last 5 years was to fight terrorism. Now, do you think our challenge is how to keep stability in our society? So the army is playing the role of the police?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that the Lebanese Armed Forces have taken on a lot of missions beyond the traditional mandate. And I think that they're doing exceptionally well at it, but it's not easy for them. But I want to give full credit to General Aoun and his staff for managing concurrent crises. But they are still focused on traditional activities that you would imagine a military do, and they're expanding out into new territories. For example, they're very active with the border security operations, maritime security. So they've got their hands full, and I think they're doing really well. Interesting.
Well, we'll get back to you on more details regarding our crisis, because this is the major topic, General Al-Hashim. So how can we bypass the obstacles facing the process of paying fresh money to the troops as a financial aid?
So internally, it's about our government. Its position is regardless for us. So they don't take care of the last standing institution. I call the LAF, instead of LAF, I call it last standing institution, LSI. First of all, we have between our hands a lot of assets, properties, including lands. We can use them in order to generate money in this difficult situation. But the main problem is you need a permission from our government. The second one is that the revenue is coming to the left directly or is going into some other places, and Lebanon is 135 at the rank in the Transparency International. So we have the corruption on the other side. And we are not guaranteeing that this money will go directly to the left, so we can benefit from as Lebanese Armed Forces.
There's no confidence now with the
government. There is no confidence. Then you need a permission. So we are not able to profit from the assets. Sometimes we have services we are affording to others, but we cannot collect fees on these services. Plus, imagine for health security, we post a $50 tax on the airport for the health security. How about the actual security? Nothing. Why not taking a part from these taxes and give it to the left so they can still standing and they still doing their missions, defending the borders, countering terrorism, preserving the internal peace. So instead of saying the $50 is going you know where, with the investigation
we don't know
still in the legal system now, and why not dedicate a part of these taxes and support the left so the left still doing its business?
Did you have this conversation with the general?
This is confidential. I can.
No, I mean, since you are now retiree and someone bringing really interesting ideas.
As a retired general, I cannot say some information that are so sensitive.
What's sensitive about it? If you advise the general,
no, sorry,
I try to help.
No,
okay.
No. If you are sitting,
you want to keep it.
No, if you are sitting with your commander, and this is a confidentiality session, so you cannot talk as you wish. You are a reporter or a interviewer doing this interview with me. I will talk about the external side. Countries like the US, especially, they have the legal issue, not allowing their government to give direct money to other troops. So how we can bypass that? They have another friendly countries. They can ask them, they can demand that if by proxy friendly countries give some of their profit or some of their assistance or some of their help
directly to the army.
Directly to the ELAF, and not passing by other bureaucracy here in Lebanon due to the corruption.
Ambassador Dorothy Shea was working on something similar with the UN, so they can maybe pass a law at the United Nations, ask these friendly countries. But what happened to this procedure?
This is not about paying directly money to the troops. This is about sharing the burden of maintenance, by example, fuel, etc., etc.
But we are already receiving these aids from the United States.
And other countries also.
And other countries.
Yes.
But I know the biggest amount comes directly from the US, maybe, as you mentioned, 80%. Yes. But we're still not getting a clear answer regarding the salary.
Yes.
I mean, this is a major problem. As you mentioned, it's not only for one soldier.
No.
Maybe he has a family of 5 members or maybe less or more.
Yes.
So how do we get above or bypass that
There are other doors that we can open. And
like
here
you mentioned,
I have a suggestion here.
What is it?
Why not ask our diaspora, which is millions of Lebanese working and living outside?
Why don't we do that?
If with the collaboration of the US, doing a conference for our diaspora, for our Lebanese living outside Lebanon, working, and they are successful people with a bunch of money, and they have the confidence in the work of the LAF. Yes. We're still having like between 70 and 80% of confidence between the Lebanese population. If we can arrange this conference, and this is a suggestion, we can do it with the appropriate side, which is the USA.
Colonel, honestly, I heard very exciting voices from diaspora. They want to help, especially after the exposure of the port of August. The only institution where people like to trust to send money was the LAF. I'm going to come back to you as well. Thank you, General Hashim, for your honest contribution here. Bilal, going back to Washington, my second home, I just want to hear more why CENTCOM appreciate the LAF so much, despite sometimes how we face challenges to convince the administration, either the National Security Council or State Department, to keep with their assistance, with their support to the Lebanese army.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Rob's list is pretty comprehensive. He hit the nail on the head. These are good students. They're easy to work with. They're humble. They're eager to learn. And CENTCOM works with a bunch of other partner militaries in the region. And this region goes all the way up to Central Asia, right? It's not just the Arab Middle East. And they really love working with the LAF because of all these reasons, but I'll just add a couple more. They're innovative. They're quite creative. I mean, they made lemonade out of rotten lemons during Nahr al-Barid, right? We all know that episode where they essentially created air power out of nothing, right? Using those helicopters and those bombs. And I think the general will tell you exactly that story, which was really quite impressive. They also are committed, like no other partner military in the region, to something we call institutional capacity building, right? So it's not just the issues of hardware in terms of how to actually effectively employ the hardware, but it's also matters that get to the very software of defense, right? To the very institutions of defense, or what we call defense management or defense governance. And we've had several teams coming from the United States to Lebanon to help the lab across all domains, right, that the Army needs, whether it's human capital, whether it's resource management, whether it's logistics, whether it's the planning, or the at least working maybe through reverse engineering on national defense strategies and so on and so forth, despite the complete non-existence, right, of any kind of civilian guidance, as Aram was mentioning before. But that's why they're so well regarded in CENTCOM and in Tampa. It's because they are so eager to learn, and they don't come to you with unrealistic, asks when it comes to equipment. They really are very keen about using equipment that they can maintain, that they can actually sustain given the lack of resources. And this legacy, this tradition has been going on since the days of Jean Ahwej, right? They don't come to you with like, oh, I want the next, fifth generation fighter jet. I mean, they understand that there's no way they can maintain it. There's no way they can sustain it. And so they come with some really specific asks that actually meet their needs. They're not preferences. They're not wildly unrealistic, unlike many other Arab partners, by the way. And so I think this is a really pretty good list of reasons as to why they are so well regarded in Tampa, and Tampa loves working with them.
Bilal, we see lobbies that make a difference in Washington exclusively. Do you think the Lebanese lobby is very weak to try to ask for this latest generation of weapons, advanced weapons for our army? And what
I don't think interacting with the Lebanese lobby, if you want to call it that, is really part of my duties in Washington. I have very little interaction, frankly, with Lebanese diaspora or Lebanese community in Washington. I don't think it's an issue really of lack of effectiveness, frankly, of any Lebanese lobby or anything of the sort. It's more of an issue of just continuing on what we're doing. I think this is really a success story that needs to be highlighted, which is exactly what you're doing now with this event, right? This is a win for CENTCOM. This is a win for the U.S.-Lebanese partnership, and this military investment has paid off in ways like it really hasn't in many other parts of the Middle East and frankly around the world. If you look at CENTCOM and its track record, and I know that my friends at CENTCOM are not going to like this, but it is the truth. You don't really have a whole lot of wins when it comes to military assistance. I mean, you've seen what happened in Iraq, you've seen what happened in Afghanistan and many other parts of the world, and not very far from Lebanon, by the way, whether it's in Jordan, whether it's all the Gulf states, although those are more customers and buyers of weapons as opposed to recipients like the Lebanese are and the Jordanians. But there's not a whole lot of success going around when it comes to military assistance. The Lebanese case, frankly, working against all odds, right? It's just remarkable that it's nothing short of a miracle how this has turned out to be a success story over the past 10 years, despite the tremendous challenges that the country is facing, whether it's economic, social, political, despite all this collapse, yet somehow, miraculously, this relationship has blossomed and has really flourished in ways like you really would like to see the same exact situation happening and being emulated in other partner countries in the region. Yet we just don't see them. But it is because of all these reasons that Rob is talking about, this very easy to work with Lebanese armed forces partner.
Thank you, Bilal. Let's move to Aram. Aram, hi again. So can you talk a bit about generational shift in the LAF and its implications for the future of the LAF and future of U.S.-Lebanese military-to-military relations?
Look, throughout this discussion, there's a theme that I think goes unnoticed and unmentioned. And that is, this is a learning institution, one of the few learning institutions in Lebanon. It's a cumulative collection of events and failures and successes, failures of leadership under fire. And with that, there have been generations that have defined their place in Lebanese military history. We have a critical generation that's entering the twilight phase, which is the cohorts from the class of 85 and 86 that are currently in command and leadership. Before them, certainly they had their peers from the class of 1980, 81, and 82, and others. This is the last of the war generation, and they are duty bound now to shepherd the next generation of military leadership at a very difficult time. And the real challenge is to bridge the gap until we can get to what is potentially the next great generation, starting with the class of 2000, 2001, 2002. Look, this is a military in the Middle East that willfully, willingly, freely wishes to be NATO interoperable, US interoperable, US and NATO standard operating procedures. This is a lesson it's learned from decades of service since its inception as a national military in 1945. And it's incumbent on the current generation leadership to ensure that this momentum remains cohesive and focused enough until we can get to a transition of leadership. With that transition comes a lot of the next levels of creativity that Bilal was talking about, and the intuitive and frankly, studious, focused effort that Rob was describing. This is a military that is going to transform again. We just have to ensure that we get to a place in time where it can do that. To paraphrase some of the comments from my peers in this discussion, we're buying time until you can have a more sustainable, even more professional LAF.
Aram, who wants to see the Lebanese army unsuccessful or weak?
Look, I'm a student of Lebanese civil military history in part, also of US other strategy in the region. Insofar as in Lebanon, look, you have had a tenuous civil military relationship in Lebanon, going back easily to the 1958 crisis. You have had successive civilian political factions who disagreed on everything, but shared the same view that the LAF is a force that is to be contained. This was certainly the case leading up to the first major civil war in '75. By the time that war kicked off, the political powers that be had done whatever they could to push back against the LAF, to sow division, and to create an environment where, frankly, the military could not act in ways that were as critical. Today, I'm sad to say that there are very few political actors, certainly among the larger groups, who share a different view. A lot of the language in public is of support. In private, it is anything but.
Like who?
Look, I'm talking across the spectrum.
Hezbollah, for example?
Well, frankly, again, across the political spectrum of this country, you have factions that will say they support the LAF, they say they support stability and military development. And in practice, it's just not the case. And you mentioned Hezbollah, that's one actor. But I would say the problem is a national one. You have a fear of a professional institution. It happens to be a military one, but there's a general fear of a professional institution that does what it's supposed to do, that shines a beacon of professional development in an environment that is otherwise known for shady deals and corruption at the political level. And the LAF is inconvenient in this way. And at the same time, these factions across the spectrum, including friends of the West, just as much as opponents, cannot exist and have a stable environment to play their dirty games in if you don't have a military that is providing the basic minimum levels of stability. It's a paradox. And all the LAF is trying to do is not get caught up in the political crossfire. And the efforts they have exerted across several commands have been commendable to that effect.
Thank you, Aram. Going back to Beirut, here, it's a hot day outside, but it's a nice conversation here in this studio. And it's actually what he said, Bilal, this is something very important for the Lebanese army to discuss its matter and with major partners, experts here in Washington. Colonel, this is a very important question and the Lebanese wants to hear it. When do you ask, or there is any intention that the United States will provide the Lebanese army some advanced weapons and equipment?
Well, look, let's look at our relationship holistically. Since 2005, we've invested $2.5 billion in the LAF because we have confidence in them. We continue to invest in a number of different ways. Let me just remind, I mentioned International Military Education Training, IMET, as one. We are very interested in upgrading foreign military financing. In 2021, we raised it to $120 million so that the Lebanese can pursue objectives that they define themselves, the Lebanese Armed Forces can pursue objectives that they themselves have defined. And that's borne fruit in a lot of different ways. In the past, up to now, we've helped the LAF acquire their flagship vessel for the LAF Navy, the Travelus, so that they can secure the maritime domain. More recently, we've helped them get fixed-wing aircraft like the A-29, rotary-wing aircraft like the MD-530, so that they can advance their integration of land, air, ground, something we call LAGI, L-A-G-I, land, air, ground integration of forces. And looking ahead, I think this relationship is going to continue. I think in the near future, well, I don't think, I know that in the near future, they're going to be acquiring 3 U.S. Coast Guard quality Coast Guard cutters, protector class cutters, again, so that they can secure and maintain dominance over their maritime borders. So those are very advanced weapons. They're very sophisticated. They're world-class weapons. And I think it reflects well on the Lebanese Armed Forces that they've asked for this equipment, that when they get it, they take care of it, they utilize it. And I think that this is the right trajectory. So again, looking from the past to the current to the future, I think our relationship is strong, and I think it's going to stay strong.
Colonel, just from your experience, so does the LAF come and request some demands aside the, I mean, like a particular weapon or equipment, or no?
You know, the LAF has never made any demands. What they've no. What they've come to us with is kind of a strategic design, a capabilities development plan over a multi-year, 5-year period. And they've said, this is where we want to go with our relationship. And we've evaluated it to say, we think we'd like to go on that journey with you. Thank you for stating your end state, your objectives. Let us help you shape those to be realistic. Some of the panelists here have talked about sustainable equipment, things that they can afford. And I'd like to say that I'm very pleased to say that the Lebanese have put skin in the game. I mean, they themselves have put national funds against some of their purchases. They're not just a donor recipient country. They're actually participating actively in acquiring world-class equipment, like I mentioned earlier, this A-29, which they use for close air support, reconnaissance, whatever they need, everywhere from the sea to the mountains, from the north to the south. So I'm really proud of this relationship, and I think that the Lebanese can feel confident that we're here to continue this relationship.
Thank you again. We're gonna go back to you in a bit as well. General Al-Hashim, yani, what would you wish, what kind of equipments and advanced weapon that the army would have for what challenges, especially in this era?
Yes, if you are talking about the threats and challenges.
Yes, exactly.
You are facing, and you build your doctrine facing these challenges and threats. You still have the external factor, which is in the south, by example, which is continuing from 1948. If you are talking about terrorism, infiltrating our borders inside and internal cells of terrorism and terrorists. So these are the threats, imminent threats. Then you talk about challenges. By example, if you are talking about more than 1 million Syrian refugees, and 200,000 of them are well trained to be soldiers, and they can carry weapons and do the fighting. So these challenges we should face.
Sleeping cells, you mean?
By example, including sleeping cells among them. So imagine this amount of personnel that are well trained in Syria, and they are living among us here in Lebanon. Imagine they are carrying weapons. So these challenges should be always put us on alert to face them. So, by example, the economic crisis right now, there is an unrest among our population because Lebanese becoming poor and poor by the time. they lost their money. They cannot withdraw their money from their banks. So they may go back to the riots, to the demonstration, and they will do you a real unrest in Lebanon. So these are the challenges and threats that we are facing. What we are trying to do is, according to these threats and challenges, we came up with a capability development plan, which is a 5-year plan. And the actual one will be due next year in 2023, with the collaboration of the United States military personnel working with us. Here, our doctrine is a defensive one. So to the viewers, we are not an offensive military. According to our law and decrees, our doctrine is a defensive one. So when you ask what kind of weapons you are demanding, it's not the kind of weapon systems that are very offensive.
Do we have anti-aircraft good system?
By example, this is what we are asking.
Why don't we have that?
Because they are defensive systems.
Yeah,
So we are not asking for fighter jets that,
Yes.
that they can fly for 1,000 miles and coming back. So this is not the type of weapons. Plus,
no, anti-aircraft.
according to our budget, we cannot afford the maintenance of a complex or sophisticated weapon systems that will cost you
They need
too much
they
money.
need higher budget.
Especially when you are talking about Air Force and Navy. These type of weapon systems are so expensive, and its maintenance is so expensive. So what we are asking, according to our CDP, Capability Development Plan, is a defensive system that will allow us to guard our borders, defend our land borders, and because the land border project was very successful, that started a few years ago, before I quit, the LAF was trying to replicate this successful project from the land into the sea. Here, again, we ask the United States and other allies to intervene on a short-term and a long-term approach. The first one, by example, after the Beirut blast, August 4th, our Navy base inside the port of Beirut was totally destroyed. So in the short term, we need to rebuild this kind of capacity for our Navy, enable to do their jobs in our maritime water. So we ask our allies to give us what is necessary. So we started by building and rebuilding the facilities over there. And then they are trying to give
contribute.
Yes, and contribute with vessels at a certain type and length, etc. To be able to do the same project at the land and replicate it into the sea. So this is the kind of capability and capacity that we are asking. It's not offensive, never.
I know you're retiree. You can vote now, right?
Yes.
Are you gonna vote?
I can vote. I can be a candidate.
For the first time ever? For the first time, right?
Yes, yes.
So how is that feeling, and why the troops are not allowed to vote when they are active in the military?
This is a good question. According to our constitution, which includes 3 articles, I think 7, 11, and 21, that ensures the equivalence and the non-difference between our citizens. So how come the safeguard, who is doing the protection and security and safety for the elections, at the same time cannot elect?
That's true.
Let's talk about the Americans. They will vote before, by example, 48 hours. For us, we will be busy the day of the election. So the readiness of the LAF will be 100%. Every soldier, every officer, every NCO should be in his work. So you cannot vote at the same day. What we are suggesting is that who is guaranteeing the process of election at the day of the election can or be allowed to vote. I will give you an example. Some candidate, do you know the quotient for their success is like 700 votes. You can be a parliament member in Lebanon, according to
the new
yes, because
law.
it's about percentage and quotient.
Probability. Yeah.
Yes. So how about 80,000 troops that they cannot
change,
vote?
They can change the
And
election.
how about their families?
True.
And their supporters?
Big time.
So why the government is giving us its back? Its view is regardless.
In this case, how can the army ask for that kind of demand? and or to lobby like to really achieve
it's our
this
government.
modification in
It's our government
constitution.
duty to amend little bit the election law to allow us previously to vote previously than the civilian, to be ready the next day to guarantee and do the safeguard of the election.
But you have voices like you are gathering and even like trying to get this voice loud and loud to make any amendment on this law?
Okay, this is a second good question. I am a political officer, and I'm not political officer. The difference is when you put the A before political, is that I don't share with the campaign for any candidate. I don't gather support for him. I don't share his ideology or his thought.
Interesting.
But when it is related to the interest of my country,
it's your right.
It's my right and it's my obligation.
True.
To intervene and save my country by my vote. So the guarantor of the election is not allowed to vote. And this is a dilemma that we should solve. And I hope that after this election, because we don't have time now to amend all these.
There's a trend. Usually, retirees, they run for election or become presidents, but they cannot vote during their service.
Imagine that. And we are 80,000. So you have some candidates their success is going by 700 votes. And 80,000 plus their family, they cannot vote. Okay? Who is doing the safeguarding of the election?
It's sad. It's really sad.
Yes. And our government should do something about it.
Maybe as the media, as us, we need to highlight more about this topic.
Of course.
Let's go back to Washington now. So, Bilal, what are the weaknesses of LAF?
What are the weaknesses? Well, first of all, let's acknowledge that even the United States military has weaknesses. All militaries around the world have weaknesses. So there's nothing unique really about the LAF. But before I get into those, just very quickly, I really want to underscore what Aram and Rob and General Hashem have talked about in greater detail, which really is this evolution of the LAF, right? Because before I talk about the weaknesses and the holes that you still have to plug, I'm just so excited about this evolution that I really want viewers who are watching this to understand what kind of a military Lebanon had not too long ago, only 10 to 12 years ago, right? And what kind of a military they have right now, right? And again, if you don't have much time to really trace that evolution, all you have to do is just look at two different battles, right? There's Nahr al-Barid and then Fashal Jurut. This was a military that barely had any kind of adequate training before, any kind of proper resourcing, barely had ammunition to even train, let alone actually use it on the battlefield. Communications was atrocious. I mean, just remember in Nahr al-Barid, they actually used cell phones, right? Not even encrypted, not military grade, just cell phones. Command and control was awful, right? Everything was controlled from Yarzi as opposed to actual
on the ground.
On the ground, you know, a more, you know, a closer, essentially, command and control arrangement to the battlefield. A military that was mocked by its peers, not even allowed to actually assume its national security responsibilities, subservient to Syrian interests, later on Iranian interests. So they were not even allowed to really perform their duties and to become an actual professional military. All of that dramatically changed, obviously, with U.S. assistance over a period of a decade plus, to now end up having a professional military that's committed to all the things that we've been talking about today. Are there still weaknesses? Yes, absolutely. But I wanted to tell you that because we had such a bad start, right?
Yes.
That it is inevitable that we still end up with a lot of weaknesses.
Are we talking after the 9 years, like after the Civil War? Is that what was the best part?
No, not even the Civil War. I'm talking
75?
about way after. I'm talking about, like I said, like I would say until 2011, we had a tremendous amount of challenges and problems that the LAF had on all sorts of levels, right? And so the Americans came in, and through, you know, a number of JMCs, Joint Military Commissions, an infusion of cash funds, an infusion of technical expertise and assistance and advice across domains. Now we end up with a professional military that can actually do a whole lot of things that they never were capable of doing, whether it's defending the borders, whether it's maintaining civil peace, and so on and so forth. What are the remaining challenges and what are the remaining problems? I think General Hashem has mentioned some of them already. But when you try to measure military effectiveness of any military, not just the Lebanese, you're not just talking about their effectiveness on the battlefield when actually you are dealing with a crisis. You also have to measure or evaluate the deterrent. And the Lebanese military still does not have a deterrent whatsoever. It is non-existent. Now, it might be too ambitious. It might be wildly optimistic for the Lebanese army to have deterrent in order to actually deter conflict before it happens. But you need to aspire to that level at some point. Okay?
Yes.
The challenge for that, as Aram and others have mentioned, is sustainment, right? So if you're going to deter, you certainly need a certain level of weaponry. You need a certain level of military equipment. But if you cannot sustain that equipment, whether it's air defense, whether it's more sophisticated air power, then you're going to face tremendous challenges after acquiring them because you have to sustain them, right? I personally would have traded the Bradleys, for example, for more sophisticated air defense. But and let's not kid ourselves, let's be very honest and candid about this. There is a political diplomatic issue going on here. I think the United States will always hesitate to provide that kind of more sophisticated air defense capabilities in the absence of a peace deal or peaceful arrangement between Lebanon and Israel. In the absence of that, it's just not going to happen. Now, the mission remains of the Lebanese army internal.
So there's a red line.
Exclusively,
so
but
Bilal,
predominant.
but Bilal, so I can understand from you, there's a red line because it's drawn in Washington because of the unstable relation between Lebanon, no peace basically between these two nations, and Israel probably will put so much pressure on the U.S. How to maybe continue that relationship with the Lebanese army, correct or not?
It's not a red line. It's a political argument that will always sell in Congress. There's no way the Lebanese army is going to receive that kind of military assistance specifically when it comes to air defense, like I said, in the absence of a peace treaty or a peaceful arrangement between Lebanon and Israel. It's just that simple. But the sustainment issue, I'm going to go back to it, is huge. The Lebanese army cannot use its own national funds to really sustain the sophisticated equipment it already receives from the United States. So if you're going to add more to that, that's going to become an even more challenging problem. Whether it's maritime capabilities, whether it's air defense capabilities, whether it's air power capabilities, to sustain those is always going to be a problem. The Lebanon doesn't receive the same amount of money as the Jordanians, for example. And I'm not even going to obviously talk about the Gulf Arabs who have their own money to purchase whatever they want. So the Lebanese are sort of at the mercy of U.S. assistance when it comes to just overall professionalizing, training, procuring, acquiring, and so on and so forth. That is the biggest challenge of the left, okay? The biggest challenge is the moment when the United States pulls the plug on that assistance or drastically reduces that assistance, the Lebanese army is going to face significant challenges in terms of not just operating on a day-to-day basis, but literally just surviving. It is that significant a challenge when it comes to sustainment. So far, so good, right? The assistance continues to flow, and the United States still believes in this relationship, and it's a critical partner to have in that part of the world. But who knows, once again, what the winds of change bring when it comes to the political environment in Washington, fiscal resources, and so on and so forth. That, to me, remains the ultimate Achilles heel of not just the Lebanese army, but frankly, any other partner army that we deal with in the Middle East that is a recipient of FMF money or Title 10 money from the Pentagon.
Interesting. Before I move to Aram, so do you also have challenges when you try your best, as definitely your experience in the military, then politics in Washington plays its role? How would it be hard on you to even try to convince people in Pentagon or in the Congress or other places that, no, we need to give more for the Lebanese army because this army has been established with us a great relationship over the years and showed loyalty and trusty. What's your take on that?
Well, you know, when it comes to political questions, I really don't have much to say. I'm not a politician.
But how much affects your work that you're trying to give more for the army? Because you really, from military point of view, you have different perspective. Because you are working with the army on the ground.
Yeah.
So when you go back to Washington, like you went back to Washington with the Tishay and Joseph Aoun. So how was your job? Just a sense of responsibility as well.
Well, it's an easy job, and it's an enjoyable job. I really like it. What's important for me to do is to accurately communicate to people, whether it's policymakers in Washington, D.C., in leaders in the Pentagon, our combatant commanders in Tampa, to accurately communicate to them, what are the conditions on the ground? What are the issues that the Lebanese armed forces are facing? How can we best assist them? What are the risks? What are the potential rewards? And how do we balance those? When it comes to making political decisions, I work very closely with Ambassador Shea to give her, immediate feedback so that she can communicate through the State Department. And what we do is we synthesize all that to come to an agreement that's best for the American taxpayer, best for U.S. foreign policy.
So we've seen that the budget has been adding and adding year after year. Do we expect more in the next fiscal budget?
Well, I don't know what the projections are yet for 2022. But again, I gave some numbers earlier. I think that, if the past is prologue to the future, I think we're on a good trajectory. I think there's a real sense in Washington that our need has that the Lebanese need has never been more critical. And when I say the Lebanese, I mean the Lebanese armed forces. That the LAF's need has never been more critical than it is now. So if there was a time to be assisting the Lebanese armed forces, it's now. And let me just add quickly that we're not only concerned with the Lebanese armed forces. The ambassador takes very seriously, for example, the internal security forces, because they are an important part of the security sector. So I don't have any projections yet for 2022, but I feel confident that there's an understanding in Washington that now is the time to stay involved, to be involved, to get involved if you're not already. And then the policymakers will figure that out for themselves.
Thank you. Going back to Aram now. Aram, so what are the Lebanese doing and not doing that affects international engagement on Lebanon and the LAF?
Let me just cede some time to Bilal. I think he had an intervention he'd like to make.
Aram, you were very generous, but this is literally going to take a minute. This is just really as a footnote to what Rob was saying. As someone who was in the Pentagon, receiving all the submissions from CENTCOM when it comes to security cooperation funds, right, that we're allocating across the entire AOR, right, across the entire area of operations. Jordan was at the very top all the time. In the entire region, guess who's number 2? It's Lebanon, right? So when it comes to Pentagon funds regarding security cooperation, Lebanon was almost at the very top, always. And so there is a good amount of generosity coming from at least the Pentagon. I'm not going to speak to the State Department because I don't have the numbers in front of me in terms of FMF. But there was always a difficult argument to make in the Pentagon, especially during my time, to increase that assistance because it was already pretty high, right? And so I want the viewers to understand that, at least in terms of my colleagues at DOD and the Pentagon, they did their part when it comes to security cooperation provided to the Lebanese armed forces. The issue is always try to up that amount coming from the State Department in terms of FMF. I hope that makes things clear. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for clarifying this. Aram, are you back to us?
Still here with you, Aram.
Okay, so I was asking you, what are the Lebanese doing and not doing that affects international engagement on Lebanon and the Lebanese armed forces?
I'll start with what they're not doing, and I'll start it by indirectly paraphrasing something that has come up regularly in discussions with successive U.S. defense officials who've had responsibility for Lebanon. There's this general assumption among many Lebanese I interact with that the U.S. somehow imposes what kind of aid and assistance Lebanon gets. It's the opposite. The question that U.S. officials ask, and the LAF certainly answers some of them, but the political powers that be don't, is who do you want to be? What kind of country does Lebanon want to be when it comes to the overall security architecture of this corner of the Middle East, let alone the larger region? And that question remains unanswered. You have a government that, after much time and toil, seems to continue to kick the can down the road on basic reforms. You have a lack of progress when it comes to the very basic levels of engagement on national security issues by successive governments. And look, I've been doing this a long time. I'm talking from 2005 to the present. You have had, at best, tangential, weak engagement by successive Lebanese governments on defense economics, defense resourcing. Lebanon has a lot going for it. It's a net exporter of intelligence. It's a net exporter of stability in a region that has not known much stability since the start of the Syrian civil war. This is a country that has, as Rob implied, a pool of motivated people who want to serve. So this is an area that I think has been ignored. And look, there are things that the Lebanese can still do. And when I say the Lebanese, I mean that to include the broad spectrum of civil military leadership. You have still a chance to re-engage on national defense. It's not too late to look at some of the basic requirements of the LAF. Look, there's going to be another capabilities development plan. That process is kicking off now. It'll take as long as it takes. And as General Hashim noted, it's a process that will start to frame 2023 and beyond. And there are questions that the Lebanese government, not the LAF, needs to answer. The LAF's role, for example, on the maritime issue, is a purely technical issue. The LAF does not have a political view.
But they did their part, Aram.
They do not.
But sadly, the politics got involved.
Excuse me, Allah, with all due respect.
Yes.
They do not have a political role in this. It is a technical requirement which they have fulfilled. You have to have a government of Lebanon that then does the difficult thing of deciding what it wants the next step to be on maritime, if it wants to make progress or not. Look, international partners are watching to see what the government does, whether it's a government now before the elections or any government that takes shape after elections, irrespective. And if it looks like stalling, it's probably stalling. And it's a sign of faith or good faith or bad faith as far as international community.
But just to make it very simple, Aram, you have like a political figure here in Lebanon is trying to sell this deal so he can exit his sanctions. I mean, the Lebanese army fulfilled, as you said, his role in the maritime border, but sadly, some people are trying to invest in our future, in the future of Lebanon, the gas, the economic crisis, you know, and maybe for our tears. But sadly, always politics is involved. I'm going to go back to Colonel Amani. Colonel, always politics involved, always. But let's just talk here. How do you, what kind of future you see for the Lebanese army in 10 years ahead if they followed the same advices, same help, or maybe even more and more? How do you see this army in 10 years from now? Definitely, I'm not going to go into the relation between Israel or not. Hopefully, there will be peace in the region. But looking forward as military, and what can also a lesson we can learn from the Ukrainian army today, who is fighting a huge army like Russia?
This is a great question, and thanks for asking. You know, I've had this conversation with senior leaders in the LAF, asking them, "What do you think is the LAF of 2030?" And I've been to the military academy, and I've seen young men and women who will be retiring, believe it or not, in the 2050s. You know, and I've often asked, what LAF will they be retiring from between now and then? I think this is a theoretical question in some ways, but I think it's a real question. I think what we're seeing around the world, and this is just my personal opinion, is a reduction in appetite for force-on-force conflicts. More and more we're seeing when there's state conflict and unfortunately sometimes conflict with non-state actors. But what we're seeing more and more is an evolution towards information warfare, cyber warfare. I think electronic warfare is becoming more important than ever. And I think that these are things that the Lebanese Armed Forces should start thinking about now and investing in developing. And again, I go back to some of my earlier comments. There's no country better prepared to take on these challenges because there are young, bright, motivated men and women who can bring good civilian educations into the early stages of developing these capabilities in the Lebanese Armed Forces. Now, I think it's also important to say that there will always be a place for militaries to have armor, to have artillery, things like that, because you need that to shoot, move, and communicate. I mean, It's never going to go away. But the balance is changing in favor of different kind of warfare. And if I look ahead at the Lebanese Armed Forces, I hope that they will take some of the lessons being learned in the 21st century and apply them to their own development.
Thank you.
I would like to answer the same question from,
Go ahead, please.
From the view of military.
From the Lebanese perspective.
Yes. First of all, let's look at the crisis we are living in, the economic and financial crisis. How about reducing the number of our troops? By example, the IMF will oblige you to cut like 30% of your personnel forces. Let's say they will ask you to have an army about 50,000 instead of 80. What would you do? Second, if they cut your budget again and again, and they did it 20% for 3 consecutive years, 19, 20, 21, what type of laugh you want? Did the government say once what type of army or what type of laugh they want? Never. So they are relying on us to manage ourselves.
To define what...
yes. So there is no grand
my
strategy.
Question to both of you, if you don't mind,
yes.
because it's very important. So, you know, it's like NBA game. They used to rely on the center to always make the score inside the zone. Now we see it's outside game. So today in the army, is it about technology and advanced, or like, as you mentioned, development, instead of the numbers of the army? It's like, for example, we see in Ukraine, we see advanced weapons that could be used easily, remotely. Drones came to play. The Bayrak, the Turkish Bayrak made a big difference in a war. I mean, this is the recent war that we watched. I was there on the ground as well. I've seen that I saw less army, but more weapons, more technology. So can we have that vision? Less army, but more technology?
We started by doing this inside the lab, and we are practicing these type of scenarios in the future, that we may see them coming. So to go back to the first question and add to the second one, the information domain is a very interesting one, and the left started introducing this fourth dimension, I call it. So you have the land, sea, and air, and then you add the information domain. And Lebanese Armed Forces started doing something, we call it as strategic communication. So this is the information domain we are living in now. So it's not only about having weapons and rifles and cannons. So we are using the information domain, and we are trying to send the appropriate message to our civilians, to our citizens, that we are the left, we are defending you, we are next to you in the crisis, etc., etc. So I'm seeing it as a mobile light laugh in the near future because of the economic crisis we are living in. So we cannot expand. And I will remember the viewer that since 2018, the laugh was forbidden from recruiting new fresh blood, new personnel, for 3 consecutive years. This is the fourth. According to the budget law in 2018, the laugh stopped recruiting new fresh soldiers.
Based on our economy.
No, it was before that, before the crisis, in 2018. They obliged us not to recruit. So here we have a huge problem about the human resources. If you are talking about getting old and you are not, feeding the whole system with a new fresh blood, how about 3 years from now? It's not about the previous 3
You always need the
And this will continue in the new budget law. Imagine they are asking you to stop recruiting. So there is no new soldiers, no new troops. How can you manage after 5 years and
hopefully
10 years from now?
with our partners,
it will affect the hierarchy. Yes, the total hierarchy.
We will not face such as challenge.
So this is the answer about what...
Actually, I'm going to come back to you. This is going to be our last part, recommendation. So maybe, Colonel, you can answer that shared question under the recommendation. What kind of recommendation you give the Lebanese army?
Well, I would recommend that you don't plan to fight the last war you fought. You should plan to fight the next war you hopefully don't have to fight. And, trends are changing. If you look at it in the long term, once upon a time, wars were fought by people on horses, maneuvering around fixed cannons, and troops were online, And here we are today talking about unmanned drones and, other people sort of away from the action, people in rooms on computers.
True. So you believe less human factor and more technology? And that's what we've seen and witnessed in this recent war?
I see that's the trend coming in, and I think anybody who looks at it with a sober eye will see that,
Tactics, of course, involved.
Right. And by the way, no country wants to send its most precious treasure into harm's way, and that's people. And technology is allowing us to separate, people as trigger pullers from, actions that could be done remotely. So that seems to be the trend. So consider it, and that would be my recommendation, to please consider.
Okay, other recommendation to the Lebanese army in this crisis, to every single soldier that listening to you now, as a Lebanese soldier, female and male soldier.
Yeah. My recommendation is keep the faith. I think you have strong leadership at the top of the LAF who understands that it's hard to make ends meet with the salary that you're making. They're trying their best. They tell me all the time. They're trying their best to help soldiers and their families deal with this economic crisis, to see their way through the political crisis, to stay above the petty arguments, and to stay focused on the mission. It's a critical mission. The LAF has a 24/7 mission, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and to keep the faith. And the selfless service is noted.
Aram, any recommendation? Always we give recommendation at our last part, so we can really listen to your advices and recommendation and your expertise coming also from different fields. Aram?
Look, I mean, the idea that has been discussed in this program about what the future LAF should look like. Look, the Lebanese military will play a part in shaping part of this. Civilian government needs to have an idea about what they want. It's to talk about reducing the force by 15 or 20,000 without having a reason or rationale driving it is not a recipe for success. There are ways to do this. I mean, after the Great Recession in the United States, you had the AmeriCorps program, which put hundreds of thousands of people to work. If you're going to transition people out of the LAF or the ISF for that matter, and you're going to do it in a way that is dignified, then you need some kind of a program that allows them to do so. But before you do that, you need a plan. The CDP-3, the Third Capability Development Plan, is the closest thing Lebanon and the LAF have to a national military strategy in the absence of a national security strategy at the government level. It's going to be a challenging exercise to write that CDP now with these economic conditions, but we have the conditions we have. So my recommendation to the LAF is to push back, to talk to government, to go on the record about its requirements, its needs, and do the best that they can. I second the view from Rob. I mean, you have military leadership that is genuinely concerned with the welfare of the warfighter in the LAF. Male, female, whether they're in administrative roles or combat duty, it's irrespective. So they're holding the line. We just need civilians in government to do the little bit that makes the difference. Aid from the US and other partners is certainly critical, but there has to be a home team effort from government and across government.
Thank you, Aram. Bilal, as well, we'd like to hear recommendation.
All good stuff that I heard. I don't want to repeat those, but if you're the LAF commander, I'd like to see him be more vocal about the national mission that he has. I'd like to see him utilize what General Hashim was saying as far as strategic communications. This is a legitimate mission, okay? And I know he's always hesitant to speak publicly and so on and so forth, but you got to be more aggressive about these things. There is no room for shyness when it comes to the responsibilities of the LAF and explaining them as clearly, impeccably as possible to all segments of Lebanese society. So you got to be more vocal about that, and you got to continue to invest in integration, not equipment, in integration, and continue to do what Aram was talking about, combined arms. you already have an advantage over many of your peers in the region who really cannot do combined arms effectively. So you've got that advantage. You've demonstrated it in Fajr al-Jurud, and then so you got to keep working on that, because this is the future of warfare. I mean, it's always about integration. It's always about combined. It's not really about the human versus the technical factor. It's about how do you integrate your weapons and how do you employ them effectively in the battlefield. So, and institutional capacity building. This is a huge mission for the Lebanese army that has paid great dividends. I know they're very serious about it. Just continue to invest in that. And I think, in those three at least, the Lebanese army is going to be in pretty good shape, assuming, of course, that assistance continues, will not be drastically reduced.
Thank you, Bilal. General Ziad Hashim, your last recommendation for this evening?
About the
collaboration part, no.
Yes, okay. Cooperation between both sides. I'm asking both sides, and I suggest that to reshape, reorganize, and implement a new defense resource management system based on direct cooperation.
Nice.
Based on common planning, based on new prioritization of the needs. Above all, this system will mitigate the time-consuming process of, sending the letter of request of the needs and then investigate it in Washington and then going back to answer you if yes or no, and then achieving and acquiring these systems and then deliver to Lebanon. So in the next CDP, we need to be engaged more and more in a direct way, in a very cooperative way, taking into consideration new prioritization.
Are you getting personally active to make this also more progressive? Why not? That's your role today.
I'm
to bring all your expertise and make joint efforts.
Yes, yes. I was trying to do this, but we need to leave the job for others. Now, for the whole spectrum as a Lebanese, for the viewers, for the soldiers, officers, NCOs, or just a soldier. Imagine, in your imagination, there is no laugh. Can we sit here in this studio?
There will not be any Lebanon. Peace.
Can we be here? Can I move from here to Tripoli, for example? Or can I go to Baalbek? Imagine, in your imagination, there is no laugh. For our citizens, for our allies, this is the last standing institution.
Last resort.
Last standing institution. Okay? The banking sector is already
collapsed.
And then the economy, the environment, everything is...
That's the result we have as Lebanese. Thank you so much.
Fight for your life.
We are fighting. Hopefully we don't have any fights, any wars. We have stability and prosperity in the future and anti-corruption. So we can all build a new Lebanon based on good mission and goodwill. Thanks, Bilal Saab. Thanks, Aram Negusyan. Thank you so much. Colonel Robert Emaini, thank you so much. General Ziad Hashim,
thank you.
It was a great conversation between Washington and Beirut. I want to thank also the Public Affairs section at the U.S. Embassy and for sure MCF and personally May Shidye, she'd make this happen again. Thank you.